Year 9, Year 10, Year 11, welcome to some quick revision on Climbing My Grandfather in preparation for your English Literature exam. This is for those students aiming for the grade 6, the grade 7, the grade 8, the grade 9. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook as well. I shall provide those details to you. You should know the poem. Naturally, if you're aiming quite high, I would think that if you come into this video for revision purposes, you will know the poem. If you don't know the poem, please read it or have it in front of you so that you can make annotations as we go. Very simply then, nothing difficult. Climbing My Grandfather, the title gives it away. The speaker climbs up his grandfather from toe to head. The poem is a single stanza. The speaker's grandfather is described and compared to a mountain on which naturally the speaker climbs up. There's deeper meaning. Clearly, the obvious idea is that the grandfather represents solidity, something immovable, a clear presence in the child's life. However, I think the opposite to that is distance, because the climb from the bottom of the grandfather to the top of him, from his toes to his head, much like the climb from the bottom of a mountain to the top, there's a big distance there. Is the distance that as the speaker ages, their relationship, there's a bit of a divide in their relationship, which I suppose is natural as we grow older, or is it a distance between the older and the younger generations? If you really want to test yourself in terms of poetry and interpretation, is there something to do with mankind and the natural world here? And don't forget, Andrew Waterhouse, the poet, was really interested in the natural world, wasn't he? Single stanza could represent the climb, the vastness and the size of the mountain, which then obviously could represent the importance of the grandfather to the speaker. Alternatively, and remember, we want to offer an alternative interpretation where we can to really hit higher grades to show the examiner that we're considering other interpretations. Does the single stanza represent the memory of the grandfather, that this is his most fond memory? Or could the single stanza even show the difficulty of climbing the grandfather once he ages? Because naturally, as we age and as our grandparents age, they become more fragile, and we, I suppose, can't climb them as easy as we could if we were a child. And I suppose there's an instance there of the losing of a memory, because again, if you start to think about when we age, what memories do we have of our grandparents, and clearly this is the most prominent one for the speaker. The opening half of the poem has a similar amount of syllables in each line, and for the most part this decreases at the end of the poem. I'm not saying it does on every line, I'm just saying for the most part. Arguably, this could signify reaching the summit. Now, what I've done is compared that to the heart of the grandfather. Naturally, the summit of the mountain is smaller in size. Alternatively, though, it could also represent the passing of time and this subtle feeling of uncertainty linked to the use of the poet's past and present. So there's quite a few things we could do there in terms of why does the syllable count change? Caesura, some people argue that it helps to mimic natural speech, and that's absolutely fine. What I try to get to do with my students who are aiming for the 7, the 8 and the 9 is to pick out a key example and explain its importance, because I would argue that a grade 5 and a grade 6 will discuss Caesura generically, and your grade 7, 8 and 9 will pinpoint a really prominent example, a poignant example, and explain why. So I've just picked out this, but you can choose your own obviously. By the overhanging church I change direction. Then we get our pause. You can see your Caesura there, and by pausing at the word direction, perhaps we can argue that life with the grandfather and without him naturally has different ramifications, and therefore the direction of someone's life and someone's feelings can change. So I think pausing at the word directions is a big moment. Again, there will be other key moments. Try and pick one and explain it. I've also suggested, if you're new to Caesura and you're not quite sure and you haven't got confidence yet, we also can pinpoint another couple of examples. We get a pause at the word ice, then scar, then heat. Now, there's a progression there. The climb means that he travels upwards towards the grandfather's heart, and this is arguably the reason the vocabulary changes from cold to warmer. And I suppose we get that notion of the heart and affection and emotion and love. So that's just something you could potentially argue. The poem also begins very abruptly. Potentially, and again, this is just me, we could suggest that this is in media res, with the first person speaker not troubling us to introduce the subject. And it reiterates that this is the spur of the moment, spontaneous affection and spontaneous moment where the child climbs up him. Also, joining them in the middle of this relationship again, I suppose leaves it open to interpretation in terms of this relationship, but also I think you can see that generically because the speaker isn't pinpointed, the grandfather really isn't pinpointed, so I think it goes universal to that type of relationship. Mountain symbolism. I love symbolism, and I try to include it in a lot of my videos. Now, what we've got to start asking ourselves is, well, why has he compared the grandfather to a mountain? Now, a mountain is symbolic of many things. So what I've tried to do is pick out a few that we can potentially argue for an answer. Obstacles. Climbing over one or passing through a range indicates overcoming an obstacle and making some progress. So again, what can we argue in this poem? Is climbing up the grandfather the moment where he starts to get closer to him, or is it the opposite? Is it a subtle hint that he's starting to forget the memories and the time he has shared with his grandfather? Climbing up a mountain or another height often indicates a spiritual or mental rising or an improvement in mentality. So again, is it that, and I'm just asking questions here, the grandfather has passed away, which is why we use the past and the present tense, and he's potentially trying to improve his mental capacity and his thoughts surrounding him, and therefore he uses this really fond memory to do so. And also, mountains symbolise permanence and immovability. Now, we discussed that before, but unfortunately there's a heavy irony there for us, because we know that where a mountain is permanent, unfortunately our grandparents aren't. Mountains can also be used to create a secluded, isolated or hard to reach place. Now, perhaps this reminiscent of the grandfather is linked to this notion of a place that's hard to reach. Again, can we be arguing that the grandfather has passed away here? I am just suggesting, I'm not saying it's right. And such a place could symbolise loneliness or difficult to achieve mental, spiritual or emotional states. So again, now we've got the flip side of that. You know what critics are like when they are arguing symbolism. We've got this notion of a mental state that's difficult to achieve. Is he struggling to overcome the death of his grandfather? Or is he struggling with the notion that the grandfather is ageing and will pass away and therefore isn't as permanent as he once thought, i.e. the mountain? Mountains also can represent a dwelling of a holy being or God, or someone or something representing a deity. Now, I am not saying the grandfather is God. What I'm saying is, could we argue that the divine thing here, the thing that is worshipped by the speaker, is the grandfather? And we've got that notion of looking up to somebody, and as children, we do look up to, and we do want to protect our grandparents and our parents, don't we? And we see our grandparents particularly as more vulnerable. More simply, they're reliable and immovable, and again, you could potentially link that to the single stanza. Language. The use of the first person pronoun I naturally makes the poem autobiographical, and this adds a more personal tone. But contrastingly, the use of the third person to address the grandfather, I think, seems distant, and therefore does that support the notion that he's reminiscent and trying to cling on and trying to grasp this memory of the climbing? He does it free without a rope or net. Possible connotations of a challenge and potential danger there, which links us to the obvious metaphor of the climbing. We must question why it is a difficult prospect to climb the grandfather, though. Is he arguably too old? Is the speaker more grown up than we first... Sorry, I've made a typing error on the first there. Is he arguably too old? Is the speaker more grown up than we first thought? We have a semantic field of mountains and mountaineering: rope, traverse, summit, altitude, screed, overhanging. I've just noted there that screed is related to rock fragments rather than the smooth finish on concrete. It has two meanings. So is this an adult looking back? And think about these words here, like rope and traverse and summit. It does link to this notion of something difficult. But intertwined with that, so we have this lexical field of the mountains, and now we have affection. and the close bond between the two when we get hot, and the stained hand. This close, detailed physical description of the grandfather's features implies that the relationship is closer than we would normally anticipate. This notion that he notices that the grandfather's hands are stained, and the speaker seems to notice the smallest detail. The irony being that physical description implies that he doesn't know him well, that he doesn't know the grandfather's personality. So that's the flip side of describing what he looks like. Just some observations then. And the poet describes his grandfather in terms of a semantic field of his clothes as well. And again, perhaps this implies that the speaker in fact doesn't know his grandfather at all. And that's why we get a superficial description of his hands and of his clothes, which has a lack of depth. As an environmentalist, Waterhouse could even be telling us something about nature too here, that as human beings we view nature, but we don't know it and we don't understand it. So linked there, we don't know the depths of nature, we don't know the power of nature, or we overlook it because we know it's there. Is it a link to the surface? We see the natural world, but often forget the beauty that is beyond the surface, and really this notion that it will outlast. Warm ice, clear oxymoron could imply that there's a sort of melting going on as he gets to know the grandfather, and there's a warmth there. Is the ice that's mentioned a barrier, a physical barrier, an emotional barrier? Ask yourself those questions. Don't feel free to ask the examiner a question as well to keep them on their toes. Suggestion and interpretation. The grandfather has blemishes on his skin of life. Scar, stained hand, loose skin. And naturally this happens with age. Alternatively, and linked to nature, is he ruined of interactions with others? Has he been stained and blemished by life? Much like in some instances we ruin the natural world because we take it for granted. Has the speaker taken his grandfather for granted? That is a good question to start asking. And we get the word discovered. That implies that the speaker is still getting to know his grandfather. And then loose skin contrasts with still firm. Look at loose and then firm. And unlike the mountain, the grandfather is mortal. The mountain is timeless. Again, that was just something very quick. Don't forget that you can find me on YouTube and on Twitter and on Instagram. On Twitter, it's at Stacey Ray. YouTube and Instagram is at Stacey Ray. And then I've also just set up a Facebook where I just put revision and things like that, quick videos, English masterclasses by Stacey Ray. I hope this was useful. It was something quick. Please check out my YouTube channel. There's Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, the other poems, English language, and massive good luck in your exams.